On Thursday, the South African Reserve Bank increased the repo rates by 25 basis points to 7.25%. Two MPC members actually favored a 50 basis points hike. Now, the raise is the eighth since the central bank began its hiking cycle at the end of 2021 when it adopted a combative stance to tame spiraling inflation. The bank's governor said the policy statement reflects that inflation globally is high. He also pointed out that the revised repurchase rate remains supportive of credit demand in the near term, while raising rates to levels more consistent with the current view of inflation and risk to it. The aim of the policy is to anchor inflation expectations more firmly around the midpoint of the target band and to increase confidence of attaining the inflation target sustainably over the time. Now, many analysts say the latest hike is very bad news for South Africans who are paying off debt on property, vehicles, and credit cards, warning that consumers are hanging on by a thin thread and there is no more room to maneuver. Joining me now is economist Felisa Nkomo. She joins me from, of course, South Africa as we look at the announcement of this rate and what it means for South Africans and the economy as well. Felisa, welcome. It's still January. Because I haven't seen you yet, I'm still going to go ahead and say Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you as well.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. All right, so let's look at this. So before the rate announcement, economists had already predicted that the bank would do another hike again, but had been split on whether it'd be a 25 basis points hike or a 50 basis points hike. Now we have a 25 basis points raise. But whether it's 25 or 50, really in the real sense of things, how much more can the South African economy and South Africans themselves really take?
No, I think that's a good question. In fact, I think we're going to continue to make the point as economists that actually now that the CPI had softened in December, there's a massive opportunity for Reserve Bank to put a brakes on interest rate increases. So, and I think that was a little bit of expectation that even though a lot of economists were saying they are likely to increase. But remember, even within economics, there are multiple schools of thoughts, right? Mm-hmm. So those who subscribe to heterodox economists or would be classified as left economists actually were convinced that there was absolutely no need for us to increase interest rate, particularly in the light of several things in the context of South Africa. Is that firstly, our economy has really not been able to grow, that this is actually an 8th interest rate, but also that, now that the CPI, the inflation, it's really given us a little bit of a 0.2%. In December, the central bank was really meant to give again a breather. But one of the things about central bank, by the way, is that it could say that through this increase, it's actually managing what we call implicit inflation, which both you and I, or ordinary citizens, are not able to see. But I think the fact that they decided to increase it by 25 basis points, it also signals that they do understand that there was actually no need for it. But because they're so conservative, but also I do think that they are actually a little bit of an alarmist in how they're managing, the inflation without really thinking about what the impact in the economy. The fifth point I want to make, which is on the table in South Africa, coming from the African National Congress conference, is the issue of actually looking at the Reserve Bank mandate. And what, as heterodox economics, that the reason central bank actually takes a stance is also because they've not been given a responsibility to deal with unemployment. So meaning that in their deliberations as the Monetary Policy Committee is that they never look at the implications of unemployment to any of their decision. And I do think that amendment into the Reserve Bank mandate is likely really to bear much more better fruit than what we're doing today.
Okay, so let's look at the sort of trend that has been laid down because, as you mentioned, there was a bit of cooling off in December, getting to about 7.2%. And some would say that gives the SARB just a little bit of room to have at least held things. But in line with that, this hiking spree started in 2021, and it's been a very aggressive and combative one, as we've seen around the world with many other central banks. But how successful has it been at taming inflation? Because if you started at 2021, it was not until December 2022 that we finally saw some amount of cooling. What do you think about the months in between? Was there really a little bit of success in terms of the stance that the MPC and the central bank has taken and the overall effect on the economy and inflation?
No, in fact, by the way, we've not seen a lot of relief. Because remember, these interest rate increases are actually intended at managing supply chain related issues, which are actually export, right? So in essence, they are not intended they are not dealing with, it's not a domestic driven inflation. Okay. So and part of it, that's why we've not been able to. We've seen certain relief. For example, government had given a bit of relief in terms of petrol price increases, but we knew though that the impact of petrol price increases will not be, it decreases, sorry, it's actually decreases. So that's the relief we've had. We knew that that decrease will not be felt immediately as they were announcing. So it's likely to take about 2 to 3 months. Now, as we're about to start enjoying part of those petrol price decreases, is that now we're confronted with the interest rate increases. And as I've been saying it with all other economists, is that interest rate increases are such a leakage to the economy. The only sector that gets to benefit is actually the financial sector, right? And now, the other point I want to make, right, which is important, is the fact that, these interest rate, the protracted interest rate we've been experiencing in South Africa, is that comes on the back of, by the way, an inflation that has been sitting at between 4.2% to 4.6% for almost 3 to 4 years. Okay, so we've not really had this much, inflation. So meaning that in terms of the inflation targeting policy of the Reserve Bank, we've really been below. So obviously, so the key issue for me is the fact that we really need to think about what is it? How does, why is there so much pressure on, ensuring that every time the MPC every quarter meets, it has to increase interest rate. Yes, there is a component that we can't not blame around the macroeconomic management, is the fiscal policy side, right? Is that what central bank is sending a message about is that fiscal policy, we have a dual responsibility to protect and insulate the economy.
Yes.
And the more the fiscal policy interventions are weaker, the more the central banks are going to have to take this hawkish conservative stance and increase interest rates. So in this context, for instance, one of the key things we've really been calling for is spending in terms of public infrastructure. And in the MPC statement, the Reserve Bank makes the point, even in the previous increases, I think November, they did make the point in October, that they're not seeing any movement around public sector investment, in particular infrastructure. So that has a massive impact in the economy because the fiscal policy activation is such a critical stimulant in ensuring that the economy remains robust.
Okay, so you mentioned the target band, and I want to take you up on that. So given that the Reserve Bank's mandate is to bring down inflation to the midpoint of that between 3 to 6% target band, do you think that the bank is done with their cycle of hiking? This is the 7th hike, rather the 8th hike since they started hiking in 2021. Some cooling in December, some expectations it was to be held this month, but that's not what we saw. Do you think we're going to see maybe a bit more tempering on the hikes in the next MPC? Or should we just buckle down? Should South Africans buckle because there's going to be another hike until the bank is satisfied with where inflation lands?
No, that's true. In fact, we really need to tighten the belt. I'm already actually been worried about the cost of food because, Russia and Ukraine export between 15 to 30% of grain in the global economy. So, and obviously our dependency to grain in South Africa and even in the rest of the African continent. So we really need to buckle up, because obviously this inflation is actually fueled by the Russia-Ukraine war. And while it actually creates an opportunity for domestic interventions, which I think the US had really started, amongst those was to really start looking at releasing some of their petroleum reserves, but also at the same time supporting farmers in the northern parts of the country to make it with seeds and also financing to make it sure that they start producing food for the domestic market. So countries like South Africa and Africa must really start doing that, because once you deal with food investment, then you deal with food insecurity, and you kind of like really you reduce the inflation. Now, even in the context of South Africa, by the way, what this inflation sends, the interest rate crisis, including the inflation, sends a message for, is that we actually need to stop planning for export-orientated economy. But we must really think about actually how do we build and boost domestic market. So in essence, without that type of thinking, and hence the point I was making, that macroeconomic management really sits between, monetary policy and as well as fiscal policy.
Okay.
And the third thing, though, is that this really affects middle class in South Africa, who in fact are such a crucial buffer for the economy, because as long as their demand and spending in the economy reduces, the poor and the rest of the economy even becomes more vulnerable to external shocks.
All right, Felisa, before I let you go, let me take you on this. So South Africa's prospects for growth appear even more uncertain than normal and pushing the bank to lower its GDP growth projections for the year. The Reserve Bank now is forecasting growth of 0.3% in 2023 for Africa's most industrialized economy. So very briefly, what do you think the top three challenges to South Africa's growth this year will be, whether they're external or internal? Just quickly as we wrap up the conversation.
There are several things, by the way. Is firstly the fact that we're not able to spend on public infrastructure. That's the first issue. And that the economy is really being driven by public sector employment. That's another issue, is that critical sectors, of course, we've seen the windfall from mining commodities, which is the coal. And I think we're still hoping that we'll see that windfall because of the increased demand for coal by European countries to manage their energy crisis. Of course, we're confronted with the energy crisis in South Africa. There's a debt crisis. There's an issue around cost of living and livelihoods. So, unemployment is likely to also to increase. So there are really confluence of issues which are both particularly sitting within the non-responsive nature of our own economic policy within the challenges that we are confronted with. So therefore, the demand is for fiscal policy to really apply expansionary fiscal policy to really make it sure that it facilitates and insulates citizens. And without that, we are actually going to really confront a real crisis that in fact that has been in existence and that has been actually exacerbated by the post-COVID effect, which is linked to high unemployment and declining industrial output.
All right, Felisa Nkomo, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you, and we'll continue to keep our eyes on what's happening with South Africa. Now with this MPC rates rise, I know the economy is going to be tighter for many South Africans, and it's going to be a difficult time in the coming months. But we are with you, and we'll be paying attention to what happens next. Thank you so much.
Thank you.